Welcome to Privacy Cast, India's leading privacy podcast. We today are going to talk about requirements for significant data fiduciaries. Today we want to talk about how the law of 2023, the DPDP, the Digital Data Protection Act, as well as the draft DPDPA rules that have just passed in 2025, make a difference, make a significant difference today in how you work, how your organization is settled, and whether your organization is a significant data fiduciary or not. So by end of this session, I hope you get your answer. So we have none other than Dhruv Suri with us. So Dhruv Suri is a partner at PSA Legal. He is a leading data privacy lawyer in India, has more than 16 years of experience in overall tech advice that he has been giving. Let's get going. So Dhruv, today we want to talk about and learn from you which organizations are significant data fiduciaries.
Thanks, Akarsh. Thanks for having me here. And it's actually a very great question because honestly, before the rules came out, I would have said that I'm going to wait for the rules to be able to respond to this more accurately. But unfortunately, I don't have a very accurate answer because the rules have not set any threshold in terms of who will qualify as a significant data fiduciary, right? Interestingly, the rules have actually said that the government can exercise its powers under Section 35 of the Act. So, this is Rule 22 of the draft rules, where the government can exercise powers under Section 35 of the Act, ask any data fiduciary to give information and data to them for the government to then evaluate the thresholds mentioned under Section 10 of the Act as to who will qualify as a data fiduciary. We will look at the volume and sensitivity of data, national security, etc. So, to evaluate those parameters, the government can now go to any data fiduciary and say, please share this data with me. We will evaluate whether you will meet our threshold of qualifying as a significant data fiduciary or not. So, who will actually be a SDF today? We don't know, but we know that the government is going to access data, or at least has retained the right to access some data to evaluate who should meet that threshold.
Is there some direction towards the threshold, like a direction, like even if let's say there's a bank out there, there's an NBFC out there, then we have organizations like Facebook, Google, Meta, Amazon, Flipkart. So is there a threshold which kind of points towards a type of organization, or we still have to wait for that answer?
Look, legally, I think we still need to wait for that answer. But today, you know, when we talk to, say, the big tech companies that exist in India and they come and say that, look, it's a little unclear whether we qualify as a SDF or not, I think that's a little, that's an incorrect approach. Because we know that if you're processing vast volumes of data, the nature of data that you're processing is fairly sensitive. I mean, if you're a social media company, there is a very high likelihood that the data you process could have some bearing on, say, election outcomes. So then you know whether you're a big or a small company, chances are that you will qualify as an SDF. So I think there is some direction in that sense, but that already existed under the Act. The rules have not really shed more light onto that.
Yeah. So thinking now, let's take the next step and thinking that, okay, we are SDF, right? So organizations generally, like how I think about it is when somebody is processing severe technicality in PII, right? Like look at biometrics, healthcare. If some once you get deep into biometrics, I think the data becomes really serious. So for sure, that should be one criteria. Children data processing should be another criteria. Number of transactions. Let's say somebody's processing 10 million user data, somebody's from 20 million. So I think that kind of transaction also should decide down the line. So in my thought process, that's something that government will definitely think about, and we'll get to some conclusion around that. But let's say somebody is an SDF, right? Let's say somebody gets an SDF. What next? What are these requirements, Dhruv, that they have to follow? And can you tell us, can you shed light on that?
Sure. So look, once you qualify as an SDF, I think one of the most important aspects then for you is to um, do your data protection impact assessments. That now there is some clarity that it needs to be done within every 12 months. So one audit per in every 12 months, followed by a data protection impact assessment, followed by an audit. What is very interesting is that the findings of this have to be shared with the data protection board. And I think that only tells you the seriousness with which this audit needs to be done. Now, the question, of course, is what all should this audit include? And this audit is largely evaluating compliance with the law, right? But there are still so many areas in the law which are subjective, where we still are hoping to get more clarity going forward. So, so for this audit to also happen, I think we should expect more information and more details coming from the government in the coming months. But I think that's the one area where we have some clarity, that you need to do a DPIA plus an audit. And the other is you need to appoint a data protection officer, right? Again, this is something that we've already known. And people will need to ensure that the right candidate is there, because there is also responsibility and liability associated with this position. Whether this data protection officer has to report to the CEO, still unclear. Unlike GDPR, where I think there is there is a very clear hierarchy set up, that the data protection officer is essentially an independent vertical, should report to the CEO. There is no such clarity in India. So
There's
to
no
some
such
extent,
clarity. Yeah.
yeah. So
So so
to some
basically,
extent,
So basically, the another I think an open point for India, and I think probably a feedback, in terms of the rules would also be that there should be more clarity. Just like we have clarity on the board formation, we should have more clarity on the DPO choice as well, because sometimes it just becomes a compliance requirement, and we all know what happens to compliance. It's a checkbox, right? And this data privacy law is not a checkbox, because we are having
yeah.
data law. We have 1.4 billion people, right? I think every other law globally has never been applied to 1.4 billion people. So I think that's where we are. Obviously, after China, right? I think after China, so China has done that. So let's see how it goes, Dhruv. Also, Dhruv, thank you for your comments, your session. This also brings us towards the end of the session today. Quickly, I want to
I
ask
want to
you.
make one final point, Akash, and I
Sure, you
think
make
that's
the
a
one
very,
final point, and one more question I have for you. Last, you
yeah.
make that point after this. What is the suggestion you have for a SDF? Right? Let's say if our organization can become SDF, what is one suggestion that you want to give to our listeners? Please go ahead, Dhruv.
Sure. So I want to make one final point, which is that another big change that has come, which I think is a bit of a step back from what the Act provided, is in terms of the localization requirement. Okay. The the act made it very clear, and I think we had sort of stepped away from, oh, will data be localized? I think the government allowed cross-border data transfer. It said if it's a blacklisted country, that's the only time where it's going to be a problem. But if you're transferring data to any other country, it should be fine. This is what the act says. Now, interestingly, the rules have somewhat carved an exception to this, which personally, as a lawyer, I feel is not compliant with the overall act and could be challenged. But the rules now say that the government, through suggestions of a committee, can evaluate certain kinds of data processed and transferred by an SDF and insist that that data should be kept in India. So there is this indirect mechanism of actually enforcing localization when the act in itself doesn't stipulate it. So whether that will be constitutionally valid or not is anybody's guess. We'll see. But I think this is an area where we'll definitely need to get some clarity in the going, in the upcoming deliberations that we will have,
I think
because
government has been really active in safeguarding the data from a perspective of our border adversaries, right? If you remember, TikTok was banned,
yeah.
Shine was banned. So I feel like we don't know what happens with the data that these organizations collect afterwards, and the government has some ideas. So I think my thought process I'm also a cybersecurity professional sometimes, right? When I look at my data and safeguard, I think my thoughts are that okay, if there is a country or there's an adversary where data is going across with intelligence, we understand that. I think that's a good approach, but getting challenged in the court for the act, I think that will be a trouble for government.
Yeah, and plus, Akash, if you think about it, right, at the end of the day, if suddenly I don't have to segregate my data sets at this point of time, right? Because it's all personal data. Like it's not as if personal data is divided into sensitive or critical under the current legal regime, right? So now, as part of my personal data set, if the government says, but I want you to keep certain part of that data in India, I now actually have to segregate that data set. I have to treat one data set separately and another data set separately, because that can't go outside India. So will that also increase the cost of actually processing that data for me? And so I think those are areas where we hope to get some clarity in the upcoming deliberations with the government as well.
Yeah, and thank you, Dhruv, for coming and speaking to our listeners, and thanks a ton for your time, for your efforts, and for your explanation. Thank you.
Most welcome.